And welcome back, friends, to another episode of the Wizard Factory podcast, where you subscribe for weekly videos exploring deeper knowledge of the universe and of self. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button to increase our reach and just help our channel grow. So let's dive right in. Last week, we introduced the first 8 runes of the Elder Futhark. So we're sort of looking at this on a very holistic, all-together sort of perspective on the progression of the runes, as Brian described last week. This idea that it's just a mere language that was attempting to copy the Greek and Latin of the time is just absurd when you look at it in this context of starting with the first rune, going in order. It very clearly describes the story of an initiation of a spiritual warrior. So I like to look at it as just that, the initiation of the warrior's journey, where in the first 8, as we introduced last week, each 8 sort of corresponds to an aspect of the 3 selves, Odin, Vili, and Ve in the Norse tradition, or you could look at it as mind, body, and spirit, where mind is the intersection between the physical and the higher spiritual realms. So with the first 8, that's the introduction of the physical world, right? When you're a baby and you're born, that's just the first moments when your body manifests in the material world. So you can kind of look at this through the law of correspondence, where manifesting physically from as above, then becoming so below. Then in the second 8 runes is all about the mental, psychological, and emotional aspects, where you're sort of, if you want to look at it like the first 8 is all about gathering your energy, you're learning your material resources, you're getting that inner strength, you are building that charge in that way. And then the second 8 is really a lot more about a refinement process. It's like taking raw materials and then processing them and getting them ready to use in a productive way, so to speak. So essentially that's how we need to be looking at this is, we've covered the physical aspect, and then with this 8, keep in mind that these are really all to do with the psychological aspect, but really keep that theme in mind of refinement. You're cutting away the excess and getting really just focusing in on what it is that you really need and focusing that power. So Brian, would you like to add anything to what I've just said, or if you'd like to just go ahead and jump right into the first rune, Hagalaz?
Dive right into it. That was definitely a good introduction there for sure. So obviously, if you haven't seen that first episode where we introduced the first 8, make sure you go back and check that out, because these are working, as Logan mentioned, they're building off of each other, so you need to be able to understand where we're coming from. And then diving into the second 8 here, we can see the first rune is known as Hagalaz, and it looks like an H right here, so it's like an H with kind of, instead of like a line going straight, it's kind of more of a diagonal. And if you really want to look up the imagery, you can put a simple Google in and you'll be able to pull up the image of it. But Hagalaz translates to hail. So this is a rune that is all about major emotional and psychological transformation. It is this hailstorm that is coming in. And when we can think of, if you imagine being, like say in prehistoric Europe in the Ice Age, having that hail and everything could definitely cause quite a bit of challenge. If you imagine just even being out in a hailstorm, be very challenging, could be very painful even. But I find it interesting that, being that this is the first rune of the second 8 and it's starting that deeper emotional and psychological transformation, when we look at our lives, many times we have to see that it takes some kind of very intense catalyst like that to actually make us start that process of evolution, where we're starting to look deeper at ourselves, we're starting to transform. And Hagalaz, if you imagine with a hailstorm, even though it may come down and be very intense at a time when it's actually happening, eventually that hail is going to melt and turn into water and nourish Mother Earth and all of these things. So it's not just, a lot of people kind of look at this rune as a negative rune, and that's not really how you should look at it. It's a challenging rune, yes, absolutely challenging, but it's for the purpose of, as Logan said, starting that process of refinement.
Very, very interesting. And if we look at this from a sort of a more linguistic perspective, and going back to the ancient Germanic language, Heil can essentially translate to the word whole. So, you know, you've heard it said when they would greet each other, they would say Heil, you know, which is actually where we get hello, hello, Heil, or Hala, relating to the primordial goddess that was very earth-oriented and also very associated with snow and ice and hail. So tying this together, what Heil actually means is whole. And so by saying Heil upon greeting, they're essentially saying, may you be whole, which I find very interesting because, again, this is where we get the word heal and health from. And so, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, sickness manifests from separation from nature. So if you are whole and not separate, then you will be in health. So this is really interesting to see how all these words sort of relate together. And I kind of also like to look at this rune as something related to that apophatic learning, where it's by your misalignment with truth and your not wholeness it's going to come down on you with that kind of harshness, but with a loving aspect behind it. It's there to get you straight back onto the correct path and in sort of unity with yourself and with truth. That's how I like to look at that one. So
yeah, excellent points.
Okay, so moving on to the next one, the rune of Nauthiz. So it can translate to need or need fire. So essentially, again, we like to look at all of these from sort of a historical perspective because it gives them even more significance to where it was being used in that mindset of the time when it was, you know, when it was being used regularly like that. The context of the Ice Age and living in this very harsh, frigid environment, fire was one of your best friends and your most needed assets. So they knew of fire from, you know, a tree being struck by lightning. They could see, you know, that this was a force of nature, but then to learn how to actually master this element and how to create that on command when needed for their very survival depended on it. So what this really means as a rune is that you've heard the saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Their need for fire in that harsh environment is what forced them to figure this out and to how to actually, you know, create fire on their own when they needed it, because if they didn't, they would die. So and you know, this is I guess in a way another way you could look at the apophatic learning as what to do by what not to do, because when you're in that struggle, you know, you have to be willing to try things even if they fail, because the alternative is sure death. So you're going to be more likely to put that out there and just keep trying things until you get what you need, because the alternative is much less desirable. And finally, I like to relate this to this New Age idea of you know, just wanting everything to be peachy, hunky-dory all the time. This really goes against the fundamental nature of the universe in the evolutionary aspect, because it is this struggle, this need, that propels evolution ever forward and pushing it. You know, it forces you to focus your logic and your intuition, and really put your mind to something to create solutions to the life situations, and you know, not just getting stuck in that learned helplessness, but being forced to actually take action and change things that you know can actually create change within. So Brian, got something to add to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely one of my, favorite runes to work with when I'm feeling stuck because, even just looking at the rune, it kind of looks like two sticks being rubbed together to create fire. So you can imagine that this essence of rune, imagine someone who, because of the Hagalaz, they're really cold. They have that, I don't know if you've ever lived in a house that's heated by a wood fireplace, but when it's really fucking cold in winter, you have that need, like, yeah, I want to get this fire going. And you can imagine someone just rubbing two sticks together, like, I need this to spark. And in the same way, when we apply it to the emotional and psychological level, this is a rune that is all about using your imagination, thinking outside of the box, trying something new, because the current situation and what has happened, you're being pushed, you're being tested by Hagalaz. So now you're needing to come up with something new as a way of moving forward. So very, very important rune to be able to learn, to master, and understand. And it really sets it up, for leaning into the next rune that we're going to be looking at, which is Isa. And this is the rune that it looks just like an eye, and as I explained here, you will see why. So Isa, it translates to ice or icicle. So just like an icicle, it has a form of its own, but it allows the light of the sun, which in the Norse perspective is also a representation of the soul. So you are a being that you have your own form, but you're allowing the light of the soul to still shine through you clearly. And that is the difference between the wounded or narcissistic ego and the healthy sense of self. And I find it very interesting that in the second 8, where we're developing our emotional and psychological maturity, first we're tested with Hagalaz. That then creates a Nauthiz, a need that we have to think how to, become inventive, use our imagination, and then through that we develop the healthy sense of self.
Right. And I like to think of it too, just imagine a teenager. So again, it's like this progression of being this, this baby in the beginning, and you need milk, and you're just trying to grow and become a strong young child. And then when you hit teenagerhood, that's where you've pretty much got the physical down, and that's when you start really, that's why they call that the age of reason, is where you begin starting to form your own thoughts, having your own questions about things, and ultimately starting to discover who you are as an individual, and out of the shadow and impression of your parents as a fully sovereign formed individual. So, and again, the ice, it relates to the icicle, and you can also think of it like the self and the cells. I like to relate those two as well, because essentially that's what it's where you're becoming a fully formed individual. And then and this leads beautifully into the next rune, which is Jera. So let's see here. It's starting to get tricky because it's back here, but it's like,
I can put that on mine if you need it.
There you go. Yeah. So it kind of looks like two hands locking together, or you could think of it as two parts of a gear, that are fitting together. And so it makes sense that once you've learned your own personal sense of self, you must now learn how to relate to others. So Jera translates to year, as in the year, the cycles, and of course the seasons, and how they all relate to each other. And you can kind of look at it as from a gradient, where even though we have a designated day, the first day of spring, this and that, these are kind of just arbitrary things that people made up to say, well, right about here is where spring begins. It's not something that actually happens overnight, but you can see that the seasons really are just this one thing that sort of just morph and form through these cycles. And and this is very much in relation to how the way we've been talking a lot about getting out of black and white thinking, where black and white would be there's 4 seasons and these are the days they begin and end and everything, and then that getting out of that mindset as this absolute thing where these are useful measurements to predict the cycles of nature and know when to plant and all this kind of stuff, but it's not this rigid thing. You also have to understand that it really is this one thing that all sorts of morphs together, like time. There's no such thing as a minute, but yet we can time something and see that time is consistent in a certain kind of way, regardless of where we draw those lines in it. So once you've learned yourself, you're relating to others. The cell, as I mentioned before, is the individual, but it has a part to play in the bigger picture. So balancing the individual and the collective is a very important part about understanding natural law. We see this a lot with, communist versus, capitalists, where capitalist is overly individualistic, and communists are trying to sacrifice the individual rights for the good of the collective, when both of those are in a state of imbalance and essentially a false dialectic. So this is really about understanding that though we are all individuals, we're sharing one singular experience of reality, and that all things are connected. It's like the butterfly effect, where one single event has a ripple effect on all things, no matter how big or small, and everyone has a role to play to varying degrees. Every action has bigger consequences and smaller consequences, and different varying degrees of personal responsibility.
Yeah, definitely good little riff there. And I think it's just really interesting to look at that before we can move to Jera, what we first have to master is that healthy sense of self. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to actually have a functional relationship with other people. So it starts with thyself, and then you have to extend that outward.
Yeah, it's kind of like, here's where the Isa is now practicing the ᛏᚠᛗᚗᚗᚗᚗᚗᚗᚗᚗ, where you not only understand where you end, but where other people's boundaries begin, and balancing the interplay between your boundaries and other people's boundaries.
Absolutely.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so definitely, excellent points about Jera there. Very important rune to be able to understand and master, because if we want to make it through this reality field, we're going to have to be able to interact with other people in a healthy way. And then the next rune leads into, which is known as Eihwaz, or Eihwaz, and this translates to yew, as in the yew tree. And the interesting thing about the yew tree is that it was a tree that in ancient Europe, shamans would actually go sit under, because they do release a toxic chemical that will actually put you into a psychedelic state. But what's even more interesting is that a yew tree can take its branches, and it will then grow them down into the ground and then sprout up again from there. So the roots will grow up and become branches, the branches will grow down and become roots. And this is a rune that is all about major transformation, but transformation that's really dealing with the life and death. So dying to the lower self to the higher, as we talk about, Odin sacrificed himself on the Yggdrasil. He sacrificed himself unto himself. This is a rune that really deals with that, because, and we can look at those branches metaphorically as the branches that are above. We can see those as our actions. Well, as we take actions, those then grow down into the ground, our subconscious and unconscious mind, which will then from there sprout up more actions. And it's this kind of continuous cycle of death and transformation and regrowth. So very interesting things that we can see with this rune. And I also find it very interesting that this rune is the very center rune of the whole Elder Futhark. This is the rune right in the very middle. So when we're, kind of along this path, we're getting to the point that we're like halfway there, we start to have to learn this process of dying to ourselves and being reborn. And not just once, it's a constant process of being willing to sacrifice yourself as a spiritual warrior every single moment of every day, being willing to let your old understandings die and new understandings come to life.
Very, very on point there, brother. Yeah, you can really see the law of correspondence at play here, where, literally as above, be going into the below, and as below as above. And definitely you see the apex of this progression, as we are, again, trying to look at this from sort of a bird's eye view of beginning to end. And this is that turning point where it's sort of like, here's where you've come all the way to this point, and now it's time to put that old self to death and be reborn into a new way, into a new paradigm. And so really where Isa is about learning who you are, Eihwaz is about learning who you aren't and facing the depths of the aspects of your identity that are illusory and no longer serving you. So again, like you said, death and resurrection. And yeah, you can really see that warrior's journey or the hero's journey in a lot of these stories. This is something that happens where they either get a near fatal wound and they're very weak and they don't, you don't know if they're going to make it, and then they kind of, or they get really sick with something, and then there's that struggle and that sort of just sweating it out and burning it with fever and all this kind of stuff, and then when they emerge, they're like a brand new person. And so this is, once again, leading perfectly into the next rune. If you'd like to point out on your there, this is the rune of Perthro. And this it actually looks like a lot cup, like almost tossing out some dice there, because this is all about your actual dharma or orlog, which translates to origin log, which means essentially what is your individual purpose in life. So it's like your destiny in this incarnation. So again, when the hero has gone through that transformation of putting the old self to death, then and only then your destiny becomes apparent to you, and then I know what I have to do now. It's that classic epic story of death and then rebirth, and now you know what you have to do, and you got to go into the belly of the beast, so to speak. So that's one way you could kind of look at that one. So
excellent point. And I got a few things to add on that here.
Sure.
One is just looking at the lot cup in general here, that Tacitus, the Roman historian who wrote about Germanic tribes, he talks about how the Germanic tribes really had a love for throwing lots, for gambling. They were always having a good time. But so I find it very interesting that if you think about gambling and then you're winning, when things are going correctly for you, you feel lucky. So for me, what this is whenever you step into your soul desire, your dharma, your orlog, that's when you start getting lucky in life. You start winning that gamble. And also, I'd like to look at, origin law, the orlog. We can see that this is operating from the understanding that you, as a infinite, powerful soul, chose a specific thing that you wanted to achieve here, a specific path that you wanted to walk, and that is the origin law. It's a law that you created for yourself, that this is what I am here to achieve. This is my goal. So that's your path. And when you find that, as you said, it really starts to help you step into your true self as a being, and relating to the hero's journey. They've went through that struggle with Eihwaz, that death and rebirth, and then they're that new person that they now know what they have to do, and then they're ready to continue on and move forward to another one of my favorite runes, which is Algiz or Algiz. This translates to elk. So this rune has a lot to it, and it's very, very powerful rune. It's actually one I wear every day on my Mjolnir. And it's a rune that represents, we can see it here, it's upside down here, but it looks, like a person with, like a shaman with their arms stood up, but it also represents the antlers on an elk. So, and many times you'll see in indigenous cultures, shamans that they'll actually then put antlers on their headdresses and stuff. And this is based off of this understanding that not only can those antlers be used for protection to keep out energy you don't want, you could also look at them as antennae. So therefore also bringing in energy in as well. So this is where you're stepping into your place in the tribe, not only as a healer and a protector of the tribe, but of yourself, learning to become your own shaman, so to speak, and be able to bring in those energies and also keep out the things that you don't want. So this is a rune that you could say deals with discernment a lot, is one thing that we could see being mastered through the power of this rune. And I also find it very interesting that all the stabs on the helm of Awe that you can see here, each one of these is a stab. These are the Algiz rune, specifically for that reason, that they bring in the energy from each of the 9 worlds, but they're also a protective energy as well. So very, very powerful rune to work with, especially if you are wanting to step into a place as a teacher, a shaman, a mystic, whatever you may call it.
Absolutely. And, right there is a beautiful example of how you can see that these runes are starting to contain many of the other runes that we've already mastered on this journey. So to be that Algiz, you have your Isa right in the middle. That's your sense of self. You've got ᛏᚠᛗᚗᚗᚗᚗᚗᚗ, which means you're protected, but you also are bringing in that which is useful to you as well. You have very strong and good discernment and boundaries and everything. And I kind of like to think of this as like a battery, where a battery is bringing in, and it's that cycle of in and out, very much masculine and feminine, receiving and thrusting or projecting in a way. And again, this is the warrior's journey where you've died unto yourself, then you've realized your purpose, and now you stand as this sort of like awakened being, where you're really, this is the first rune where I feel like you're really starting to learn to acknowledge and begin to wield your power. Once you've been building that energy up, and then you're refining it, and this is that turning point where you're like ready to actually rock and roll, basically. So antlers, antenna, I feel like that's sort of, and it even looks like, if you look at an old trailer home, it kind of looks like one of those old antennas that sit on the end of it there. So it's point. Like stepping into the true power like a battery, like a conduit of energy, a trained warrior who understands offense and defense. That's what makes a good warrior. You've got both. And then, and so finally, this brings us to the last rune of the second set of 8, called Sowilo. So it actually looks like
an S.
It looks like an S, or even like a lightning bolt. And this translates to soul, which can actually mean in the soul, the essence of your true self as an individual conscious being, but also soul like solar, because these things, as above, so below. The sun represents the soul as the soul represents the sun. These two are very, they reflect one another in this way. And this is really becomes the rune of finally connecting or having a Jera with your own soul, you have your purpose, you have your power now, and now it's kind of like you can think of Iron Man, where that light right here is just starting to glow and activate, and you're connecting to that true core essence of your being.
Another interesting thing I find interesting to show that how truth is discoverable through many traditions. For any of you, those who are students of astrology, or if you're not familiar with it, in astrology we also look at the sun as the soul. Right. So I find it very interesting that we see this not only reflected in the runes in the Norse mythology, but as well as throughout, Vedic and Western astrology too, that we can look at the sun as the indication of the soul and where it's sitting. And to get back in, keep with this theme of all these runes are building off of each other, we have to master all these other runes before we can really come into true connection with our soul. And then when we can start to do that, and we do make that connection, it sets us up for the next set of 8, which we'll be covering in next week's episode, that deals with the spiritual plane. So then we're taking this refinement even further, and then we're starting to move through higher and higher realms of awareness.
Right. And you can even look at this again, all about cycles and movements through Jeras. As if you look at Brian, you've got the north there. The north node is the realm of Niflheim, which is actually the realm of unmanifested potential. So this is where we actually come from the Fehu and come into existence. But we go through all these runes to actually come back there, because we've manifested physically. Again, correspondence. We've physically manifested from the metaphysical, learned to tap into the metaphysical through the physical, and then use that to actually leverage ourselves up and propelling our consciousness back up to move on to new states of being, and as ascension, or however you want to look at that. You're moving up climbing that ladder, so to speak. So correspondence there. Again, you can see that it doesn't matter what angle or what approach you take. Natural law is self-evident everywhere, and clearly the Norse people had a very deep understanding of the laws of nature, and these runes very much reflect that in my opinion. So Brian, did you
more to add on
that
actually?
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, you can actually take the runes and coordinate them with the Helm of Awe, not how they're pictured here, but you can actually take a rune from each one of the 3 sets and then place it. So for example, starting in the north, you would place Fehu, Hagalaz, and the first rune of the third 8, which is Eihwaz, and then continue on. So the second runes go here, and then when we get to the realm of Alfheim, which we've talked about before, is the realm of our ascended masters, our ancestors. This is where the rune of Sowilo falls. So if for me, it shows that to get that true connection, that deep connection with our soul, it's really important to connect with our ancestral lineage, to connect with our ancestral guides, and have that support behind them, because you definitely have a deep connection with them. And if you're cutting yourself off from that, or if you're thinking they were just primitive barbarians and things, you're really not. You're cutting yourself off from a whole lot of potential energy, potential knowledge that you could be tapping into if you had that Jera, that connection with those ancestors that have been here and walked the path before you, and that are there to guide you along the way into coming into deeper and deeper levels of connection with yourself.
Right. So I think that's going to wrap this up for this episode. And so next week, we hope you'll join us as we get into the final 8 of the Elder Futhark. If you are enjoying this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you as a part of our soul family here. And what do you tell us what you think about the runes? Do you think they're useful? Do you think that they just seem like superstition? Whatever it is, let us know. We want to we want to have a conversation. So leave a comment down below. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All those links are down below. We try to keep each of these platforms a little bit different so that there's value, individual and unique to each one, of course. And I can't recommend enough checking out, if you haven't yet, the free initiation package. It's absolutely free. Check that link below. Get some free premium content. And until next week, be empowered, inspired, and encouraged.